Okay, thank you, George. So I'm very grateful that you invited me to accept for this talk. So then we can meet also in this way. And also last time when I presented my previous paper, it ended up in management science. So hopefully we can repeat that sequence also now.
No, this one will go to econometrica. No, where you have to
Yeah, it should be, of course, an increase in the efficiency in that sense.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. Yeah, it's work in progress, so comments are very much appreciated also during the talk. So just let me know when something is unclear. So, well, it's an investment in a durable good market, and it's joint work with Herbert and with Xingang, who are also online present. So we are still working on it. All results probably we have, but we are now in a process of writing it down. So any comment we can use, in fact. So what is the problem? We consider a firm, and with its investment, it can obtain a monopoly position in a durable goods market. And in this durable goods market, we deal with demand uncertainty because you do not know how much the consumers will like it in future. And also consumers are heterogeneous. And the latter aspect turns out to have a considerable impact on the optimal decision of the firm. So let me start out by showing the three main results. And that is, well, with the first bullet point, it is when consumers have a kind of homogeneous valuation for the good. So they all assigned an almost equal value to it. Then it's optimal for the firm to serve these customers all approximately at the same time. So for that, you need a large production capacity. And to acquire a large production capacity, you need to have a large investment. A large investment is expensive. And in order to make that profitable, you should invest at the moment that demand has sufficiently grown. So that means the firm should invest late, so it should wait until demand is at such a high level that such an investment is profitable. In case consumers are very heterogeneous, meaning that there are consumers that assign a very high value to the product, and there are also consumers that assign a much lower value to the product, then what it is optimal for the firm to do is to price discriminate. So that means it is making it especially profitable if it set a high price to the high valuation consumers and a lower price to the others. And that means, in fact, that you serve a limited number of consumers at the same time because you pick always that part of the consumers that have an almost equal valuation, and you offer a similar price to them. So then your production capacity need not be too high. So that is a much cheaper investment. And then, in fact, demand does need to be that high for such an investment to be profitable. So then a firm can invest early. You do not wait until demand is that high. Well, we can connect this also with uncertainty. You can distinguish between very uncertain projects, that demand uncertainty is fluctuating a lot, or not so much uncertainty. So when uncertainty is fluctuating a lot, when there is a high project value uncertainty, well, we know from the theory that, in fact, this generates a value of waiting. And that means, you should invest late. So in that sense, you connect it to the first bullet point, and that means that, especially when consumers are almost homogeneous, then the value is high because in such a circumstance, it's a good thing to invest late. Well, on the other hand, if the project value is low, then in fact, there is not so much a value of waiting. You should invest early. We enter the second bullet point, so that is connected with when there is a lot of consumer heterogeneity. So when the consumer population is homogeneous, this goes along with high uncertainty. Then you have high value. If the consumer population is very heterogeneous, well, then you're better off with low project value uncertainty. Of course, the firm cannot choose this, but that gives a kind of high value in these two cases. Okay, so what is the problem? The problem I already told you, the investment decision of a monopolistic firm in a durable good market. So what is a durable good? Definition of a durable good is that it is a good that if it is acquired, it can be used for a long time, and people do not buy it very often. Think about television set, think about a car, think about the refrigerator, and there are many other of these examples. So you do not buy it every day. In fact, it lasts several years before you buy such a new product. In the economic theory, durable goods has very central in this economic theory of durable goods is the cost conjecture. And the cost conjecture can be explained in 5 bullet points. In fact, first of all, the high valuation consumers are served. And after buying the good, such a consumer leaves the market because, you buy it only once in several years. And then the lower valuation consumers are left, so the firm drops its price to serve the remaining consumers, and this goes on over time until also the least valuation consumers are served, and then the price is equal to marginal cost. However, consumers are not myopic, so they already foresee this, that the price will drop over time. So what they are going to do, they are all going to wait until, in fact, this price equals marginal cost. And then, in fact, if they all buy when price equals marginal cost, the profit of the firm equals 0. So this was a conjecture by Coase done in 1972, and later on it was formally proved in a couple of papers that you see listed here. And, it turns out that the important assumption is in this that, in fact, the sales are unlimited in size. So the firm can sell unlimited amounts at each point in time. So that means if a high valuation consumer waits until the price equals marginal cost, this high valuation consumer knows that it will be served almost immediately, and that makes it valuable to wait. Okay, but then in 2008, a very important paper appeared by McAfee and Weissman in Review of Economic Studies, and in fact they relaxed this latter assumption that firm can sell unlimited amounts at each point in time by introducing production capacity, by introducing an investment decision. And then this production capacity serves as an upper bound on sales. And in fact, then it turns out that a firm makes positive profits, because then this high valuation consumer is not willing anymore to wait until price equals marginal cost, because then still the firm cannot sell all these products at the same time to all the consumers. Well, McAfee and Weissman, the aim of them was to disprove this Coase conjecture, because if you think about this Coase conjecture, it's kind of a strange result, because it's a monopolist in a market and still it is not able to make any profit, because all consumers, they wait until the price equals marginal cost. So the McAfee and Weissman were eager to disprove this conjecture, and they managed to do so by introducing this costly capacity. Well, in fact, our focus in this paper is different. We build on McAfee and Weissman, but instead of disproving the Coase conjecture, which it's already done, in fact, we want to concentrate on determining the optimal investment decision. And to do so, we extend the model of McAfee and Weissman in 2 ways. We introduce demand uncertainty. McAfee and Weissman do not have that. And in the case of McAfee and Weissman, consumers were heterogeneous. But what we want to do is to distinguish different scenarios where the heterogeneity is different in different scenarios. So we introduce a parameter that measures this consumer heterogeneity. Okay, so let's go to the model. We have a durable goods market, and each consumer in the market, it demands just 1 unit and then leaves the market because the goods is durable. To consider this consumer heterogeneity, we give each consumer an index Q. And the Q is between 0 and Q bar being positive. So after the purchase, the consumer leaves the market. And in fact, on this 0 Q bar dimension, the consumers are uniformly distributed with density 1. So given that each consumer demands just one unit, total sales are bounded and are just equal to this Q bar. Yeah, and the kind of the crucial aspect of a durable goods market is that the consumer buys the good only once and then it uses the television set forever. The valuation of the consumer. So we have heterogeneity and we have uncertainty. So the valuation is the V, and in fact the heterogeneity is captured by this PQ and the uncertainty is captured by the X. So the heterogeneity is determined on the Q that each consumer has. So we have this PQ level here. And we see, in fact, that the larger is the Q, the lower is the heterogeneity of the lower is the consumer valuation for the product. And the lambda is then the parameter I talked about before that measures, in fact, the level of consumer heterogeneity. And what you see, it works as a mean preserving spread. The mean of the consumer valuation coming from the PQ is Q bar over 2. And then the lambda determines how much it spreads out from above Q bar over 2 and below Q bar over 2. Okay, and then the second part of the consumer valuation is the X. And the X, in fact, is geometric Brownian motion. So if the consumer valuation is very uncertain over time, the parameter sigma is large. Yeah, so you see the dx consists of two parts. You have the deterministic part and the stochastic part. In the stochastic part, you have the parameter sigma. So the stochastic part is important if the sigma is large. And the omega is an increment of a Wiener process. So this is normally distributed with mean 0 and the variance dt in continuous time. And then we have the deterministic part where we have there the trend parameter is the mu. So if the mu is positive, then yeah, in fact, this consumer valuation is increasing over time. I saw just before I was just looking at my slides and I saw that mu is a positive parameter. In fact, this mu can also be negative or it can also be 0. Yeah, if it is negative, then you expect that consumer valuation is decreasing over time. What did I want to tell more about this? Oh yeah, what I also forgot is that the mu is less than R. Yeah, so R is the discount rate. And so the trend parameter is always below the discount rate. I should have written that, but I forgot it. Okay. So, well, let's concentrate on this PQ part a bit more. And let's consider the both extreme situations. The first extreme situation is when lambda is equal to 0. So then, in fact, consumer valuation is homogeneous. Then all valuation of all consumers are equal. Of course, they are fluctuating over time with the X, but they are fluctuating over time in the same way. So then the valuation of the consumer is this Q bar over 2 plus X. Then the other extreme situation is when the heterogeneity is maximal, then lambda is equal to 1. And then consumer valuations are the low valuation consumer has an X, so that is the consumer with the index Q. Yeah, because if you have of Q bar, so if this Q is Q bar, then you see this is 0 and then it's just X. Or the consumer with the highest valuation has an index equal to 0 and then it's Q bar plus X. Yeah, and you see the mean preserving spread, it's always around the Q bar over 2 that the consumer valuation coming from the PQ varies. Okay, well, before the firm is active on the market, it requires an investment. So the firm has to choose a time tau that it invests, and it also has to choose a level of the investment, the production capacity K. So the K can be large, the K can be small, it is endogenous. And in order to invest, the firm needs to incur investment cost, and it is linear in K, where delta is the unit investment cost. Yeah, is a positive parameter. As usual in such a model, the capacity investment is one time and irreversible. Sometimes this can give problems with the interpretation of the model, but not here, because note that at the moment a consumer buys, it leaves the market. So the number of potential consumers decreases over time. So that means when you need a large capacities, especially in the beginning. So it is not needed to increase capacity during the sales period because the number of potential consumers is decreasing. Yeah, so the capacity investment is one time and irreversible, so it's an innocent assumption in that sense. Then we, in fact, introduce an additional assumption. We do this in order to make the timing aspect, to model it in a proper way, so that firms really need an incentive to wait. And that is that, in fact, the deterministic part of the consumer valuation is not high enough to warrant a profitable investment. So the delta is larger than this 1 over R times the maximal valuation coming from the deterministic part. So in fact, you need the X to be large enough for a investment in order to be profitable. Yeah, R is the discount rate. I think I already told you, but that you didn't see it yet. So, okay, like this. Okay, so then after the firm has invested, the firm has another decision to make, and it has to choose a price schedule. The price is given by U, so the notation is a bit strange because we have the P already as part of consumer valuation, and the price is the U. We wanted to have this notation because also McAfee and Weissman have this notation, and such a review of economic studies paper is quite influential, so we thought it is good to keep the same notation as that they have. So after the investment, which takes place at time tau, the firm has to choose a price schedule. Yeah, so, and by choosing the price schedule, the firm takes into account that each consumer solves his own problem, and that is to determine the optimal timing to buy the goods. So knowing the price schedule of the firm, the consumer in fact maximizes its surplus consisting of the consumer valuation. This is P plus X minus the price it needs to pay for the good, and it is properly discounted. So then, in order to determine the price schedule, we introduce an additional assumption, the same as McAfee and Weissman did, that if the number of consumers that are willing to buy the product is larger than the production capacity, in fact, the consumer that have the highest valuation for the product, they have priority, they buy. And they are most eager to buy the product, so it makes sense that they are buying. What we obtained from another paper from Ortner is in fact that if these buyers behave optimally, then it is, well, it's not so surprising, but in fact, the consumers with the highest valuation buy first. So this implies that there is a skimming property. So to say that during the sales period, you can always distinguish a QT, such that the consumers with a higher valuation, so with a smaller Q, have already bought, and with the larger Q have not bought yet, so they are still on the market. Yeah, so remember that consumer valuation is decreasing in Q. The Q equal to 0 is the consumer with the highest valuation. The Q equal to Q bar is with the lowest valuation. So, but at each point in time during the sales period, there's a QT, which is kind of the indifferent consumer. That is the consumer with the lowest valuation that already bought. Oh, and that is indifferent will come later. That is, you will see later. Okay, what is the objective of the firm? It's a profit maximizer. So it sells the products, and the revenue from the product is the price times the quantity, and the quantity, so is the rate of sales. This is the Q. And of course, then you have to subtract the investment cost. So the firm needs to decide about the time to invest, the amount of investment, the size of the production capacity to be the acquired K, and the price schedule. What is interesting here is that the sales do not only depend on the production capacity and the current stochastic valuation part of the consumers, and not only the current price, but on the whole price schedule. Because assume that the price schedule is such that the price is decreasing a lot over time, then consumers have an incentive to wait. So if the price is decreasing too much, consumers do not buy now, but they buy later. So that you can feel that, in fact, the current decision of the consumer to buy, it does not only depend on the current price, but it also depends on all the prices in the future. Another thing is that, of course, total amount of consumers is Q bar. Each consumer buys 1 unit. So total sales are limited, so the sales period is finite. At one point, the market is saturated, and that is when the total sales equal to Q bar. So that means that we can define a capital T, which is the length of the sales period. So if tau is the investment time, at time tau plus T, the firm has served all potential consumers. They all have their 1 unit of the good. And the market is saturated at tau plus T. Okay, so there are 3 decisions that the firm needs to take, and let's work backwards. Yeah, so given that the firm has already invested and has acquired the capacity size K, then this optimal price needs to be determined. Yeah, so the price schedule is given by U star, and the firm needs to determine this price schedule. Once this price schedule is determined, then we have a project value, which depends on the capacity and on the current consumer valuation, the stochastic part of it. Yeah, so when we have this function, we obtain this function at the moment that we have the optimal price schedule when we insert it in the profit function. Then, in fact, we have a project value depending on K. We can take first order condition, and this gives us the optimal capacity given the X. So given this stochastic part of the consumer valuation. Yeah, and when we have this, we have K as a function of X. We have also the price function as a function of X. In fact, we can determine the optimal X where the firm should invest. So this is the optimal timing. How is the optimal timing? It is not that the firm chooses a tau. Well, indirectly it chooses a time tau, but it's chosen such that at this time tau a certain level of X is reached. So you can imagine if the X is large, then consumers also assign a high valuation to the product and they want to pay a high price, and the investment is profitable. If the X is low, well, the consumer do not want to assign a high price to the products, and in fact then if the price is not so high, the investment is not profitable. So somewhere there is an X star, which is the lowest value of X for which in fact the investment is profitable. To determine that X star, you have to realize that the firm there is indifferent between investing and waiting. Well, upon investment, it receives this project value V, and when it waits, it still has the option to invest, and the value of the option we define by F. So at the moment of investment, there is a value matching. So the values match between the project value after investment and the option value before investment. And in order to determine this X star, you need an additional condition, which is called smooth pasting. So that is, you differentiate V with respect to X, evaluated at X star. You differentiate the option value with respect to X, evaluated at X star, and you have the 2 conditions that determine the X star. I didn't talk about this option value. Yeah, so this project value V is in fact this V here, with the optimal K of X inserted here, so then V becomes a function of X. So that we have here. The option value, well, that can be determined by standard methods. You need Ito's lemma, you need the Hamilton-Jacobi-Bellman equation, and that in fact gives a value of ax to the power beta. Beta is greater than 1, so the option value is convexly increasing in the X. And in fact, it's important, both A and beta are constants, but it's important to realize that this beta depends on, in fact, the trend parameter, mu, it depends on the uncertainty parameter, sigma, and it depends on the discount rate, R. Yeah, so this is the way to determine the X star. Okay, then let's solve this model. We work backwards, so given that the firm has already invested and has acquired a production capacity K, we are going to determine the optimal pricing scheme. So we have the skimming property, the buyers with the lowest Q with the highest valuation buy first. The QT is the indifferent consumer. In a moment you will see that it is indeed the indifferent consumer. Then we have from McAfee and Weissman, and that also turns out to hold for our model, is that the firm produces up to capacity, So in fact, the sales at each point in time, they are equal to K. So the capacity is always fully used. So that means that the Q value of the marginal consumer, in fact, moves with the K. Yeah, you can see it here. This is this equality. And you see at time tau, this is the investment time. So nobody has bought yet. So then the consumer with the highest valuation that has already bought is zero because nobody has bought it. But then it increases with K because over time consumers are buying and they're buying at with a speed of K, which is the level of the production capacity. Yeah, all capacity is used in order to produce goods and to sell them. And in this way, so the Q is going up. And at the moment that the Q reaches Q bar, all consumers are served. And in fact, the market is saturated. So the length of the sales period is Q bar over K. Then an optimal pricing scheme should satisfy the indifference condition. That means that the consumer that buys now has a surplus of P plus X, consumer valuation, minus the price. And this consumer surplus should be equal to the surplus if the consumer would buy 1 moment later. So let's define this 1 moment by a delta period later. So we have to discount, and then, in fact, if the consumer is indifferent, then the consumer surplus is equal to this valuation that holds at T plus delta minus the price that holds at T plus delta. So the consumer of QT should be indifferent. Why should it be indifferent? Assume that this is a strictly greater than sign. Well, this consumer would still buy if the firm would increase its price U a little bit such that we get equality. Yeah, so if it is strictly greater than, it's not optimal for the firm because the firm could have asked a higher price to this consumer. Same idea for the consumer the final consumer that buys, the consumer with the lowest valuation indexed by Q bar. The valuation of this consumer is P plus X with P of Q bar. The price it pays with Q bar. Well, assume that the price would be strictly lower, then the firm could have made more profit by increasing its price until this equality holds. So indeed, an optimal price schedule should also satisfy this equality and this equality. And it should satisfy that the firm produces up to capacity and that sales rate is equal to K. Taking that all into account, we get this proposition. Yeah, so we get a pricing scheme where the price is equal to the consumer valuation plus an integral. You may think at first instance, you may think, oh, the price is higher than consumer valuation. Why should the consumer buy? It's not true because this integral, the value of this integral is negative. Yeah, remember that the part that considers the consumer heterogeneity, the P prime, is in fact negative. So P is decreasing in Q. So this integral is negative. That means that consumer of type Q has a positive surplus. And this consumer surplus is given by this expression. So it's minus this integral, with the P prime being negative, so it's positive. And you see it's also deterministic, and that is because, well, consumer valuation determines additively on X, and the price determines additively on X. So if we have valuation minus price, the X cancels out, and you just have the minus the P prime integral there. Then, in fact, this corollary is very important. Yeah, what we see is that the heterogeneous consumer population gives a high consumer surplus. Yeah, and that is because a high price decrease can be expected. Yeah, so in fact, heterogeneous consumer population means that P prime is very negative. Yeah, so this integral has a large value, gives a high surplus. So the intuition is if the consumer are very heterogeneous, then in fact, the high valuation consumer at the moment that it buys, it can expect that the price drops enormously in the next periods, because to serve the other consumers, the firm has to let its price decrease a lot because the other consumers have a much lower valuation, because the consumer valuation is heterogeneous. So that means that the current price, in order to tempt the high valuation consumer to buy, the current price should be low enough. And if the current price is low enough, the consumer surplus is high. Okay, so keep in mind that we have this proposition, and we use this expression here. We know the part, the consumer valuation part connected with PQ has this expression, so we can plug it in here. And then we have the Q bar and the Q. Well, we have already seen that because firm produces up to capacity, sales equal K, so the indifferent consumer index has this expression. We have the Q bar equal to KT. These two expressions can be plugged in the price schedule. Then we get a price schedule that is equal to the stochastic part of the consumer valuation plus a time function. This time function indeed can be differentiated with respect to time. And that what we see is what we can expect already, that the price is decreasing over time of the deterministic part. Of course, the stochastic part can still fluctuate, but when we concentrate on the deterministic part, it decreases over time. And that is the high valuation consumer are served first. But then to serve the other consumers, you need to let decrease the price, otherwise they would not buy. And what is crucial to see here also for our main result is that the price decreases faster when K is large. Yeah, so when the production capacity is large, then more consumers are served within a certain amount of time. And then, in fact, in order to serve all consumers, the price decreases more. So if K is large, consumers have more incentive to wait because they can expect a larger price decrease. And well, this is not so good for the firm if there is a high consumer heterogeneity, because then what firms want to do, they want to price discriminate, they want to ask a high price to the high valuation consumers. Well, if the price decreases a lot, which is when K is large, these consumers have an incentive to wait, so they are not willing to pay this high price. So in order for the high valuation consumers to pay this high price, the K should be small. Yeah, and there you have the connection with heterogeneous consumer population and a small production capacity, which was one of the main results that I started with. Yeah, and you see also that lambda times K. So if the consumer population is very heterogeneous, the lambda is large, and in fact there is a large price decrease if the K is large. Yeah, this is indeed very influential. If the lambda is large, you have to be careful with the K. Then it is better to have a low K. Illustration here in this beautiful figure. So we have two cases here. In the green situation, the lambda is large, so then the consumer population is heterogeneous, and you see among this mean preserving spread here that this is the mean here, and that in fact the high valuation consumer assign high valuation to the product, and the low valuation consumer a low value to the product. In the case of black, the consumer population is more homogeneous. You still have high valuation and low valuation, but the mean preserving spread is not so big. Yeah, and then what you see is important is then we consider two price schedules. The dashed is a price schedule when the K is small, when the K is low, and the dotted is when the K is higher. And you see there is a huge difference between the price schedules, between the prices, if the K are so much different. So if it's a small K, you have a high price because then consumers have less incentive to wait. And then when the K is high, the price is much lower. Well, this effect is not so prominent if the consumer heterogeneity is much lower, if the lambda is lower, because then you see the prices are almost equal. Yeah, this is this effect here, the lambda times K. So if the lambda is small, the K has not so much influence on the price decrease. So there you can already see our main result, that if consumers are very heterogeneous, do not invest too much, acquire a small production capacity because that enables you to charge a higher price. Okay, having the price schedule, then we can plug it into the project value. We can take first order condition, and then we get this equation. and this implicitly determines the optimal investment size, the capacity to be acquired, depending on X. It's implicit, but still we can obtain some properties. The first property is, well, if X is larger, so the consumer assigns a higher value to the product, the firm invests more. Yeah, and second, well, the dependence on lambda. It always holds, in fact, that in all our numerical experiments, we found that K is less than the scale, K is larger than the scale lower bar. And then, in fact, it turns out that the K is decreasing in lambda. So that confirms what we already obtained. If consumer population is more heterogeneous, then a small production capacity enables you to price discriminate. Well, if it's almost homogeneous, then it's good to have a large capacity because then you can serve all consumers at approximately the same time with the same price. So having this K as a function of X, then in fact we can find the optimal investment threshold as a given K. This we have explicit. Well, if we know K, we have it explicit. And it depends on, well, it is this expression here. Well, as I told you before, if the X is below the threshold, the firm waits. And it invests as soon as X reaches this threshold. And when the X is larger than the threshold, the firm invests immediately. What we can obtain that X increases with sigma. You may wonder, where is the sigma? I do not see a sigma, but the sigma is in the beta. And in fact, it turns out that if the sigma is larger, then this fraction beta over beta minus 1 is increasing in the sigma. So in fact, X is increasing in the sigma. So this is kind of a standard real option result that if the uncertainty is larger, the firm waits longer with investment. So it will invest at a larger X. Also, X increases with K. It makes sense that if the investment is more expensive, you want to have a higher consumer valuation. Consumers want to pay a higher price, so a higher investment cost requires a higher revenue, and that you obtain in this way. Then with the lambda, if K is small, the X decreases with lambda. Yeah, that is, you want to, a K small allows you to price discriminate, and this is good when the consumer population is heterogeneous. So that means when the lambda is large, then in fact the investment is profitable, so you want to invest soon. So therefore decreases with lambda. Opposite, when K is large, then in fact X is increasing in lambda, so then you invest late if the consumer population is heterogeneous. Yeah, a homogeneous consumer population means that, well, the value of the investment is connected with the consumer that assigns the lowest value to the product. And when the consumer population is homogeneous, the lowest valuation consumer assigns a relatively high value to the product. So then you want to serve the consumers at the same time. And then it's profitable in that situation. So then, in fact, the X is increasing with lambda. So then you invest relatively soon because then the project is more profitable. Okay, so we had K as a function of X, X as a function of K. We put this together and then we obtain a unique threshold value X star connected with a unique production capacity level K star. And then we obtain that level. We do not have nice explicit formulation, but in fact they both satisfy the equalities I showed you before, but we can show that these are unique in fact. Yeah, and we have the standard real option result that if there is more uncertainty, you invest later in a larger capacity level. Okay, then in fact we can also find a relationship with the firm value and the uncertainty level or the trend level. So remember that the beta is the positive root of this expression, so it depends on the mu and the sigma and the r. And in fact, it can be shown that this beta over beta minus 1 is larger if the mu and the sigma are larger. So then the firm's option value, in fact, if the uncertainty is relatively low, so if the beta over beta minus 1 is below some level A, so it's low, then there is not so much uncertainty in the market. Then if there is not so much uncertainty, the firm acquires a small production capacity soon, and this is good for price discrimination, so this you want if the lambda is large. In the other opposite situation, if the market is very uncertain, you invest late in a large production capacity. This is a good thing if the product market is homogeneous, because then you can serve all consumers at the same time against the same price. So then, in fact, if the lambda is small, the firm's option value is large. And in between, in fact, then you have U-shaped. So what you want, a clear situation as a firm, either that the product market is homogeneous, so that you invest a lot at a late point in time, or that it is completely heterogeneous, that you invest not so much, so that you can price discriminate, and you do it early. So then this is illustrated in this figure. So if you have a fluctuating product market, a large sigma and a mu, then in fact you invest late in a large production capacity, and that you do when you ideally do when the consumer population is homogeneous. So then the option value is large when the lambda is small. So homogeneous consumer population. Opposite case, when the consumer valuation is not fluctuating so much, you invest early in a small production capacity, you price discriminate, and this is especially profitable in a heterogeneous product market, so when the lambda is large. So we compare this, what does this durable goods result bring concerning this valuation of the investment option? Well, we also considered non-durable goods. In fact, this was a bit more difficult than expected, so we are still working on this, but well, in the end, we are sure that this will occur, only we need to prove it properly. But what we already proved is that, in fact, F being increasing in lambda will not occur in the non-durable goods case. And that is not surprising, because this F increasing in lambda comes from this price discrimination aspect, that you want to assign a high valuation or a high price to the high valuation consumers. And these consumers leave the market, and then the price drops. But in a non-durable goods market, consumers do not leave the market. They always are the same, because if you buy your bread today, you also buy it tomorrow. So then you cannot price discriminate over time. And in fact, the choice is then between serving all consumers at a relatively low price, or only serve the upper end part of the market. And that you do in the U-shaped version. And in the version where sigma mu is large, then you serve all consumers against a relatively, still a high price, because also the high valuation or the low valuation consumers have a high valuation, because in a homogeneous consumer population, they still assign a relatively high valuation to low valuation consumers. So you see, the big difference is you do not have this price discrimination aspect in the non-durable goods market. Conclusion? Well, I think then I have to repeat everything that I said. 3 decisions: investment time, investment size, and the pricing schedule. And there is a difference with a high uncertainty and a low uncertainty, but I think I already told this. Thank you for your attention.